Some falls don't start with a step, they start with a betrayal. The wind cut sharp across the cliffside, carrying the kind of silence that feels louder than a scream, and Emily Carter stood there, 8 months pregnant, her hand resting on her stomach as if trying to steady something deeper than her balance. The horizon stretching endlessly in front of her like a promise that had already been broken, and behind her, the faint crunch of gravel under expensive shoes signaled a presence she knew too well. A presence that once felt like home and now felt like something colder, something unreadable. Daniel Carter didn't rush. He never did. Every movement calculated, every breath controlled. The same man who once whispered dreams into her ear, now standing just feet away with a distance that no amount of love could close. She didn't turn around right away, not because she didn't know he was there, but because a part of her still hoped, irrationally, desperately, that this moment wasn't what it felt like, that this wasn't the end of something she had spent years trying to hold together. "You said you wanted to talk," she finally said, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her, the wind tugging at her coat, her hair brushing against her face like a quiet warning. There was a pause, the kind that stretches longer than it should, heavy with everything unsaid, and then his voice came, calm, detached, almost bored. "I did," he replied, and there was something in that tone that made her chest tighten, something final, something closed off. She turned then, slowly, meeting his eyes, searching for anything familiar, any trace of the man she once knew. But all she found was distance, a quiet calculation that didn't belong to love, didn't belong to marriage, didn't belong to the life they built. And for a brief second, everything felt still, like the world itself was holding its breath. Emily's mind flickered through memories, late nights waiting for him to come home, excuses that stopped making sense, the subtle shifts she tried to ignore, the feeling of being slowly erased from her own life. And then another presence entered the space, not physically close, but undeniably. There, Vanessa Blake stood a few steps behind Daniel, her silhouette sharp against the pale sky, her expression unreadable but unmistakably confident. And in that moment, something inside Emily settled, not fear, not shock, but clarity, the kind that arrives too late to change anything but just in time to understand everything. The wind picked up again, stronger now, tugging harder, and Emily instinctively stepped back, her foot brushing the uneven edge behind her. Her heart quickened, not from panic, but from realization. This wasn't a conversation, this wasn't closure, this was something else entirely, something colder, something deliberate, and Daniel took a step forward, just one, measured, controlled, and in that single movement, the truth became undeniable, not through words, not through explanation, but through the absence of both. Emily's breath caught, her hand tightening instinctively over her stomach, as if protecting what mattered most, and for a fraction of a second, time fractured, the sound of the wind, the distance of the sky, the weight of everything unsaid collapsing into one singular moment. And then it happened, not violently, not dramatically, just a quiet shift of balance, a loss of ground where there should have been stability. And as the world tilted, Emily didn't scream, she didn't reach back, she didn't beg, because somewhere in that instant, she understood that the fall had started long before her feet ever left the ground. And as the horizon disappeared from view, one thought echoed louder than anything else. This wasn't the end, not yet. The air rushed past her ears, not loud but constant, like a whisper that refused to stop, and for a moment that felt impossibly long. Emily Carter was suspended between what had been and what was about to become, her mind moving faster than her body, stitching together fragments of truth she had spent months trying to ignore. Daniel's distant eyes, the unanswered calls, the quiet way he had already begun living a life that no longer included her, and somewhere in that unraveling, another realization settled in, colder than the wind itself. This had not been impulsive, it had not been a moment of anger or confusion. It had been decided long before they ever stood on that cliff. Her breath came uneven, not from fear but from the weight of understanding, the kind that does not break you all at once, but instead reshapes you in silence. Below her the world blurred into shades of gray and blue, the edge she once stood on now impossibly far away, and yet her mind did not stay there. It drifted somewhere else entirely. Back to a quiet kitchen filled with morning light, to the soft hum of a coffee machine and the gentle rhythm of a life that once felt secure. She could see herself standing barefoot on cold tile, waiting for Daniel to come downstairs, waiting for a version of him that no longer existed. The memory flickered and shifted, replaced by late nights spent alone, dinners that went untouched, conversations that felt rehearsed and hollow. Every small moment now revealing itself as a piece of something larger, something she had not wanted to name, because naming it would have meant facing it. And facing it would have meant accepting that the man she trusted had already stepped away long before she ever realized she was standing alone. The wind pressed harder against her, tugging at her coat, at her hair, at the fragile thread of calm she was holding onto. And still she did not scream, not because she was unafraid, but because something inside her had already moved past fear into something quieter, something steadier, a clarity that did not ask for permission. Her hand remained over her stomach, a silent instinct stronger than anything else, grounding her in a moment that refused to be defined by what was happening around her. And in that instant, another memory surfaced, one she had buried beneath excuses and second chances, a message left unanswered on Daniel's phone, a name that appeared too often to ignore, Vanessa Blake. It had started as a suspicion, then a doubt, then a certainty she tried to soften with logic, telling herself there must be another explanation, that she was overthinking, that stress had made her imagine things that were not real. But deep down she had known, she had always known, and now that truth no longer needed confirmation. It stood undeniable, as real as the air rushing past her, as real as the absence of the man who should have been reaching for her, but was not. Time stretched again, bending in ways that felt unreal, and Emily's thoughts slowed. Not because there was nothing left to think, but because she had reached the end of questioning, the end of wondering why, because the answer no longer mattered. What mattered was something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with Daniel or Vanessa or the life that had just slipped away. What mattered was that this moment, this fall, was not going to be where her story ended. And as that realization settled into something solid and unshakable, her breathing steadied, her grip tightened slightly. And for the first time since the ground disappeared beneath her, Emily Carter did not feel like she was losing everything. She felt like she was about to survive it. The world did not end when the ground disappeared. It shifted, it softened, and then everything slowed into a strange, suspended quiet that felt almost unreal, like the moment just before waking from a dream. And then there was nothing but the sound of wind fading into something distant, something quieter, something that felt like absence itself. And when awareness returned, it did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments. A flicker of light behind closed eyes, the distant echo of voices that did not belong to memory, and the unfamiliar weight of stillness pressing gently against her body. Emily Carter did not move at first, not because she could not, but because she was listening, searching for something she could recognize, something that would anchor her to reality. The air felt different here, calmer, carrying the faint scent of earth and something clean, something untouched. And slowly, carefully, she drew in a breath, then another, each one steadier than the last. Her hand moved instinctively, the same protective gesture she had repeated without thinking, grounding herself in what mattered most. And for a moment that stretched quietly between breaths, she simply existed, not as the woman who had been betrayed, not as the wife who had been left behind, but as someone who was still here, still present, still holding on to something that had not been taken from her. And then the voices became clearer, not threatening, not urgent, but controlled, measured, people speaking with purpose, footsteps approaching but not rushing, a calm that contrasted sharply with everything that had come before. She opened her eyes slowly, the light soft and filtered, not harsh, not overwhelming, just enough to reveal shapes and movement without forcing her to confront everything at once. Above her the sky no longer stretched endlessly. It was partially hidden by the outline of trees, branches swaying gently as if nothing in the world had changed, and that realization settled deeply. The world had not stopped. It had not paused for her pain. It had simply continued, indifferent and steady. And for the first time, she understood that survival was not dramatic. It was quiet. It was subtle. It was the simple act of breathing when everything else had tried to take that away. A figure moved into view, not close enough to overwhelm, but present enough to be real. A man's voice followed, calm and steady, asking a question she did not fully register at first, something about whether she could hear him, whether she could respond, and she did not answer immediately, not because she could not, but because she was choosing to return, choosing to step back into a reality that had already tried to erase her. Her lips parted slightly, her voice faint but clear, enough to exist, a single word forming without effort. Yes, and that word carried more weight than anything she had said before. It was not just a response, it was a decision, a quiet declaration that she was still here, still present, still unwilling to disappear. The man nodded slightly, his expression unreadable but focused, and in that brief exchange, something shifted again, not externally, but within her. The realization that she had crossed a line, not the edge of a cliff, but the boundary between who she had been and who she was becoming. And as the voices continued around her, steady and controlled, Emily Carter did not close her eyes again. She kept them open, watching, listening, absorbing every detail of this new reality, because somewhere deep beneath the exhaustion, beneath the confusion, beneath the quiet aftermath of everything that had just happened, a single thought began to take shape, slow but undeniable. This was not the end of her story. This was the beginning of something else entirely. Time did not rush forward after that moment. It unfolded slowly, carefully, like something fragile being handled with deliberate precision, and Emily Carter became aware of the steady rhythm of movement around her, not chaotic, not overwhelming, just purposeful, voices low and controlled, hands adjusting something near her shoulder, a blanket drawn gently across her body to shield her from the cool air. And through it all she remained still, not out of weakness, but out of observation, taking in every detail as if her mind had shifted into a different state, one that prioritized clarity over emotion. The man who had spoken earlier stayed within her line of sight, not too close, not intrusive, but present in a way that felt intentional, his expression calm, his tone even when he spoke again, asking her simple questions, grounding questions, her name, whether she could feel her hands, whether she could hear him clearly, and each time she answered, her voice grew slightly stronger, not because her body had fully recovered, but because something inside her had already begun to stabilize. Her thoughts no longer scattered, no longer chasing the past, instead settling into something sharper, something focused, and then the memory returned, not as a shock, but as a quiet confirmation. The cliff, the wind, Daniel's voice, Vanessa standing behind him. It all aligned now without distortion, without doubt. And for a brief moment her eyes closed, not in escape, but in acknowledgement. She let the truth settle fully, without softening it, without questioning it, because there was no longer anything to question. When she opened her eyes again, the world felt different, not safer, not kinder, but clearer, and that clarity carried a weight that was both heavy and steady at the same time. The man beside her introduced himself simply, Lucas Reed, his voice carrying the kind of confidence that did not need to be proven, and she recognized something in his presence, not familiarity, but control, the kind that came from someone who understood situations quickly and acted without hesitation. He explained in calm, measured words that he had been nearby, that he had seen enough to act, that help had arrived quickly, and while his explanation was brief, it was enough. Emily did not ask for details. She did not need them, because the outcome was already in front of her. She was here, she was breathing, and that alone was enough to understand what had happened. What mattered more was what came next. The question hung unspoken between them, not asked out loud, but present in the space nonetheless. What would she do now? And for a moment, Emily did not answer, not even to herself, because the answer was not something that could be rushed. It was not something that belonged to impulse or emotion. It required something else entirely, something deeper, something deliberate. Her gaze shifted slightly, taking in the surroundings more fully now, the outlines of trees, the muted colors of the terrain, the sky above that looked exactly the same as it had before everything changed, and that sameness felt almost ironic. The world unchanged while her entire reality had been rewritten, and yet, Within that contrast, something began to take shape. Not anger, not grief, but intention, slow and steady, building beneath the surface like something that had been waiting for the right moment to emerge. Lucas watched her carefully, not with curiosity, but with understanding, as if he recognized that whatever she decided next would not be spoken lightly. And when Emily finally spoke again, her voice was quiet but unmistakably firm, not directed at him, but at the moment itself. "I am not going back." The words settled into the air with a finality that did not need to be repeated, and in that instant, a line had been drawn, not just between her and Daniel, but between who she had been and who she was becoming. And for the first time since everything began, Emily Carter was no longer reacting to what had been done to her. She was beginning to decide what would come next. The words lingered in the air long after she spoke them, not loud, not dramatic, but final in a way that could not be undone. And for a moment nothing moved. Not the wind, not the people around her, not even the quiet rhythm of her own breathing. It was as if the world itself paused to acknowledge the shift that had just taken place. Emily Carter was no longer standing at the edge of something uncertain. She had already crossed it, and there was no returning to what she had left behind. Lucas. Reed did not respond immediately. He simply studied her with a calm that suggested he understood more than she had said, as if he recognized the difference between someone who was still deciding and someone who had already made up their mind. And then he gave a small nod, not approval, not agreement, just recognition. "Then we move forward," he said quietly, his voice steady. And those 4 words carried a weight that felt unexpectedly grounding, not because they promised anything, but because they acknowledged something real, something that did not depend on the past. Emily shifted slightly, becoming more aware of her surroundings, the steady presence of people who were not part of her life, but had stepped into it at a critical moment, the quiet coordination of movements, the low voices exchanging information, everything controlled, everything purposeful. And in that structure, she found something she had been missing for a long time: stability, not the kind that came from appearances or carefully maintained routines, but the kind that existed beneath the surface, built on action rather than illusion. Her thoughts moved again, not back to the cliff, not back to Daniel, but forward, tracing possibilities she had not allowed herself to consider before. What did it mean to not go back? Not just physically, but completely. What did it mean to step out of a life that had defined her for years and into something unknown? The question did not frighten her the way it might have before. Instead, it settled into something quieter, something that felt like space, like room to breathe. Lucas spoke again, this time more directly, explaining that arrangements could be made, that there were places she could stay where she would not be found easily, that privacy was possible if she chose it. And while his tone remained calm, there was an underlying certainty in his words, the kind that came from experience, from having handled situations that required discretion and control. Emily listened without interrupting, not because she was unsure, but because she was measuring each word, weighing each option against something deeper than convenience, against the quiet determination that had begun to take shape inside her. She understood what he was offering: safety, distance, time, and all of those things mattered. But they were not the only things that mattered. Her gaze shifted slightly, focusing on a point beyond the immediate scene, as if she could already see the path unfolding ahead of her, not clearly, not in detail, but enough to know that it existed. And when she finally spoke again, her voice carried a different tone, not just firm, but deliberate. "I will need time," she said, and the words were not a hesitation. They were a plan: time to understand, time to rebuild, time to become something stronger than what had been left behind. Lucas nodded again, this time with a faint acknowledgement that suggested he had expected nothing less. And in that quiet exchange, an unspoken agreement formed, not based on obligation, but on mutual understanding. Emily was not being rescued. She was being given space to rise, and as that realization settled into something solid, she felt the last remnants of hesitation begin to fade, replaced by something steadier, something that did not depend on anyone else's actions or decisions. The world around her continued to move, the voices, the steps, the quiet coordination of people doing what needed to be done. But Emily Carter was no longer simply part of that moment. She was beginning to move beyond it, not away from what had happened, but through it, and with each steady breath, each quiet thought, she felt something rebuilding, not the life she had lost, but something new, something stronger, something that would not break the same way again. The next few days did not arrive with clarity. They unfolded slowly, measured in quiet hours and unfamiliar ceilings, in the soft hum of a place that did not carry memories. And Emily Carter found herself in a space that felt intentionally neutral, a private residence tucked far enough from the world she once knew that even the air seemed different, cleaner somehow, untouched by everything she had left behind. Lucas Reed had arranged it without explanation, a location that asked no questions and offered no connections, and at first Emily did not explore much beyond the immediate room, not out of fear, but out of focus, her energy directed inward, towards something that needed rebuilding piece by piece. Her body moved carefully, each step deliberate, not fragile, but aware, as if she was learning again how to exist in a world that no longer felt predictable. Mornings came quietly, without urgency, sunlight slipping through wide windows and stretching across empty floors, and she would sit there for long moments, not thinking about what had happened, not replaying it, but allowing the silence to settle into something that no longer felt uncomfortable, something that felt necessary. Lucas visited occasionally, never unannounced, always measured in his presence, bringing updates that were brief but precise. Legal inquiries had begun, questions were being asked in places that mattered, but nothing had been made public, not yet. And Emily listened without reacting immediately, not because she was indifferent, but because she understood now that timing was not something to rush. One afternoon, he placed a folder on the table in front of her, simple, unmarked, and stepped back without explanation, giving her space to decide when to open it. And when she finally did, hours later, the contents did not shock her. They confirmed what she had already known: financial records, hidden transactions, connections that had been carefully concealed, pieces of a larger pattern that revealed just how deliberate everything had been. She closed the folder slowly, not overwhelmed, not even surprised, just certain, and in that certainty something shifted again, not emotionally, but strategically, because for the first time she was not just processing what had been done. She was beginning to understand how it had been done, and more importantly, how it could be exposed. The days that followed became more structured, not dictated by others, but chosen by her. She began moving more, walking the length of the property, feeling the steady rhythm of her own steps grounding her in the present. Her reflection in the glass windows no longer looked like someone uncertain. It looked like someone in transition, not fully formed yet, but no longer the person she had been before. And with each passing day, that transformation became more defined, not dramatic, not visible to the outside world, but undeniable within her. Lucas returned again with more information, this time not just documents, but options, legal paths, controlled exposure, ways to bring truth into the open without losing control of it. And Emily listened carefully, asking questions now, precise, focused questions that revealed how much she had already begun to think ahead. This was no longer about reacting. It was about positioning, about choosing the moment when everything would shift. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried a calm that had replaced everything else. "Not yet," she said, closing the folder again, her gaze steady. "When it happens, it needs to be undeniable." And Lucas nodded slightly, not surprised, because what stood in front of him now was not someone recovering, it was someone preparing. And as the sun dipped lower outside, casting long shadows across the quiet space, Emily Carter stood there, not as a victim of what had been done to her, but as someone who was building something far more powerful than revenge. She was building control, and this time, it would not be taken from her. Weeks turned into months, not marked by calendars, but by quiet progress that did not ask for recognition. And Emily Carter began to change in ways that could not be measured in numbers alone. Though the numbers did shift, slowly at first, and then with steady consistency, her reflection becoming lighter, stronger, more defined, not as a reaction to what had happened, but as a decision about who she would become. Mornings were no longer still and uncertain. They carried purpose now, structured routines that rebuilt not just her physical strength, but her discipline, her control, every step intentional, every action chosen. And in that repetition, she found something that had been missing long before the cliff, a sense of ownership over her own life. Lucas Reed observed the transformation without comment, his presence still measured, still distant enough to respect the boundaries she had set, but closer now in understanding. He provided what was needed and nothing more, access to information, connections that extended far beyond what Emily had known before, and through those connections, the world she had once been excluded from began to open in a different way, not as a guest, not as an accessory, but as someone learning how it truly operated. She studied everything: the structure of Daniel's company, the financial patterns hidden beneath polished reports, the way influence moved quietly through decisions that never made headlines. And the more she learned, the clearer the picture became. This had never been just personal. It had always been calculated, built on layers of control and concealment. And now she understood those layers, not emotionally, but strategically. Her questions became sharper, her focus more precise. She was no longer asking what had happened. She was mapping how it could be revealed. One evening, Lucas placed another document in front of her, not a folder this time, but a single page. A public announcement, a major corporate gala scheduled in less than 30 days, an event that would draw investors, media, and executives from across the country, a stage large enough to shift perception in a single moment. Emily read it once, then again, her expression unchanged, but something behind her eyes settled into place. This was not coincidence. This was opportunity, and for the first time, timing aligned with intention. She did not respond immediately. She set the paper down and looked out through the wide glass windows, the sky dimming into evening. The reflection staring back at her no longer resembled the woman who had once waited for someone else to define her worth. It was someone else now, someone who understood that power was not loud. It was controlled. It was precise. It was knowing exactly when to step forward and when to remain unseen. When she finally turned back, her voice was calm, but there was no hesitation. "That is where it happens," she said, not as a suggestion, but as a decision. Lucas held her gaze for a moment, as if measuring the weight of those words, and then gave a slight nod. Not surprised, because everything about her had been building toward this. The months of silence, the careful preparation, the refusal to act too soon. It all led here. Emily stepped closer to the table, her fingers resting lightly on the paper, not gripping it, not claiming it, just acknowledging it. And in that quiet gesture, the plan became real, not in details, not yet, but in direction, the kind that does not change once it is set. And as the room fell back into silence, broken only by the faint sound of wind against the windows, Emily Carter stood there with a clarity that left no room for doubt. She was not returning to the world she had left. She was stepping into it on her own terms. And this time, she would not be the one who disappeared. The night of the gala did not announce itself loudly. It arrived with a quiet precision, the kind that carries expectation without needing to say it out loud. And across the city, lights stretched in perfect symmetry, reflecting off glass towers and polished marble like a world that had never been disrupted. Inside the venue, everything moved with calculated elegance. Conversations layered over soft music, glasses raised in controlled celebration, names exchanged with practiced familiarity. And at the center of it all stood Daniel Carter, composed as ever, his presence commanding without effort, his voice steady as he greeted investors and partners who saw only what he allowed them to see. Beside him, Vanessa Blake moved seamlessly through the room, her confidence polished, her smile effortless, the picture of a future already secured. And for a moment, everything appeared exactly as it was meant to be, untouchable, complete, until the doors opened again, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a quiet shift that barely drew attention at first. And then it did, slowly, like a ripple moving through still water. Heads turned not because of noise, but because of presence, a figure stepping into the room with a calm that did not ask to be noticed yet commanded it anyway. Emily Carter walked forward with measured steps, her posture steady, her gaze clear, and there was something about her that made people look twice. Not recognition at first, but something deeper, something that felt familiar in a way they could not immediately place. The transformation was not just visible, it was undeniable, not in appearance alone but in the way she carried herself, controlled, deliberate, unaffected by the space she had once belonged to but now moved through on entirely different terms. Conversations faltered, not all at once, but in small interruptions, pauses that stretched longer than expected. Whispers beginning to form at the edges of the room. Daniel noticed it before he saw her. The shift in attention, the subtle change in energy, and when he finally turned, the expression that crossed his face was not shock, not immediately. It was something closer to disbelief, as if the reality in front of him did not align with what he had already accepted as truth. Vanessa followed his gaze, her confidence holding for a fraction of a second before it adjusted, her posture tightening ever so slightly. Not enough for most to notice, but enough to reveal that something had changed. Emily did not stop walking until she reached a point where the distance between them was undeniable, not close enough for confrontation, not far enough to be ignored. She stood there in the open space of the room, not claiming it, not challenging it, simply existing within it in a way that shifted its balance entirely. Silence moved outward from that moment, not complete, but enough to draw focus. Enough for attention to settle where it had not been intended to go. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried clearly, not raised, not forced, but steady in a way that cut through everything else. "I believe there are things that need to be clarified," she said, and the words did not sound like an accusation. They sounded like a statement, controlled and deliberate. Lucas stood at the edge of the room, unseen by most, his presence quiet but positioned, and with a subtle signal that did not draw attention. Screens across the venue shifted, presentations interrupted, replaced by something else entirely. Numbers, records, timelines that did not align with the story that had been presented for so long. The room changed in that instant, not with chaos, but with realization. Conversations stopped not because they were forced to, but because they no longer made sense in the context of what was being revealed. Daniel's composure held, but only on the surface. Beneath it something fractured, something that could not be corrected with words or gestures. Vanessa's expression shifted again, this time more visibly, her confidence replaced by calculation that arrived too late to regain control. And through it all, Emily did not move. She did not raise her voice. She did not step forward. Because she did not need to. The moment had already shifted, the truth no longer hidden behind carefully constructed appearances. And as the weight of it settled across the room, one thing became clear without being said. Everything that had once seemed untouchable was no longer out of reach. And Emily Carter stood there, not as someone seeking attention, but as the reason it could no longer be avoided. The room did not erupt. It tightened, like a held breath that no one dared to release. And in that tension, everything became clearer than it had ever been before. The screens continued to display the details without interruption, numbers that did not match public statements, timelines that overlapped in ways that could not be explained away. And the quiet confidence that had filled the space only moments ago began to shift into something else, something heavier, something that did not rely on speculation but on what was now visible to everyone present. Daniel Carter remained standing at the center of it, his posture still composed, his expression controlled, but the foundation beneath that control had already begun to fracture, not visibly at first, but in the way his gaze moved, in the slight delay before he responded to the murmurs rising around him. The people who had once leaned and now held back, not stepping away entirely, but creating space where there had once been closeness. Vanessa Blake stood beside him, her earlier confidence replaced with something sharper, something more guarded, her attention shifting rapidly, as if searching for a way to regain control of a situation that was no longer hers to manage. And through it all, Emily Carter remained exactly where she had been, still, composed, her presence unchanged by the growing weight of the moment, because this was not chaos. This was precision. This was the result of months of silence, of preparation that did not seek attention but demanded it when the time was right. Lucas Reed moved quietly along the perimeter, unseen by most, ensuring that nothing interrupted what had already been set in motion, not interfering, not directing, simply allowing the truth to unfold exactly as it had been designed to. And as the final set of documents appeared on the screens, the shift became undeniable. Conversation stopped not out of politeness, but because there was nothing left to say that could reshape what was already understood. Daniel finally spoke, his voice measured, attempting to regain the control that had defined him for so long, offering explanations that sounded structured, deliberate, but now carried a weight that did not land the same way, because the room had already moved past listening. It had moved into observing, into recognizing the difference between presentation and reality, and that difference could not be undone. Emily did not interrupt him. She did not challenge him directly, because she did not need to. The moment no longer required her to prove anything. It had already done that on its own. Instead, she took a single step back, not retreating, but releasing the space, allowing the focus to shift naturally, and in that subtle movement, something final settled into place. The power that had once defined the room no longer centered around him. It had shifted entirely, not to her in a way that demanded attention, but to the truth itself, and that was something no one could control. The silence that followed was not empty. It was decisive, filled with understanding that did not need to be spoken out loud. And as the tension slowly began to dissolve into quiet conversations, into measured reactions, Emily turned slightly, her gaze moving across the room one last time, not searching for validation, not waiting for acknowledgement, just observing what had already changed, and then, without hesitation, she walked away, her steps steady, her posture unchanged, not looking back because there was nothing left behind that belonged to her anymore. Lucas fell into step beside her at a respectful distance, saying nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said. The outcome was already clear, and as the doors closed quietly behind them, the noise of the room faded into the background, replaced by something far more important, silence, not the kind that comes from absence, but the kind that follows resolution. And in that silence, Emily Carter did not feel the need to celebrate. She did not feel the need to explain. She simply existed in a space that she had reclaimed entirely on her own terms, and somewhere far behind her, in a room that no longer held power over her, a man who once controlled everything was left with something he had never prepared for, the quiet realization that some losses cannot be reversed, and some truths, once revealed, do not need to be repeated.